Hi. Welcome. There's so many people here. So, what happened? Did you just turn it off?
No.
There we go. I'm Jim McMurry. I'm with Milton Security. This is Neely. He's with Lawrence Livermore Labs. And this is Chelle. The three of us... Oh,
I'm driving? Okay.
Yeah, you're driving. The three of us conducted our first training class together, teaching Web App Security at ISACA LA, and it was Web App Security for Dummies. This past, what was it?
April.
April. And we went into this thinking, you know, we're going to do this for dummies. We're going to have really dumbed down things. We're going to fill up 2.5 days worth of material. It's going to be great. It's going to be awesome. We sent all the students a bunch of information that they needed to prepare for, what kind of machines we wanted. We told them we're going to give them Raspberry Pi Zeros with all the content on it. All they had to do was make sure that they had local admin permissions on the machine so they could plug in the Raspberry Pi Zero.
And we sent this out twice in emails before the class.
So,
full disclosure.
What we're going to talk about today is our background, the takeaway from the class that we gave, and what this talk is all about. We're not going to get really technical or anything like that. Out of that training course, we came up with what we consider the cheating way of doing web app security. Changing the methodology from a standard textbook of a single circle to doing everything at once, ADD style.
Mind using the mic? There's a web stream.
Sorry. You're going to have to leave it on. Yeah. Okay. So we created this web app security class for dummies, like I said. We targeted a really basic level of skills. The people who were coming to it were auditors, GRC people. We figured they'd at least know some technology, something. And we were really amazed of what level they actually knew. We used Matilde, Samurai WTF, OWASP Zap, and of course the Raspberry Pi Zero. The takeaway from the class that we gave was we found that our dummies class was way too high. Way too high. We spent the first day probably a good 4 to 6 hours explaining to these people what a web app even was.
Only 10% of the class actually came totally prepared. We spent hours working with the other 90% trying to get them up to speed.
When we started the class, we had said, come with your system updated. Over half the machines, once they got on our network, started downloading updates.
No, 60.
60%. Jim built a...
Oh, say that? Yeah.
Excellent suggestion.
Very, very excellent suggestion.
We also found that when we did get... we created a classroom in a box with a NUG and an access point, and things were going great, but at random times, the hotel IDS would try and shut down our wireless, which I'm sure, by the looks in the audience, nobody has dealt with that in this room. Yeah, you don't have to stick up your hands. So if you could see it from this side, your hands are up.
So what is this talk all about? It's about giving you what we call the cliff notes of web app security, from both an internal perspective and if you're doing assessments against your clients. Something short, sweet, and simple. And highlight the real life methodology in all of this. Chelle brought up a great cartoon that she'd found. It's a new delusion. He thinks nobody's collecting his personal information online, which truly is a delusion nowadays. In the perfect world, all these great technologies that we're buying as part of IT teams and security teams, all these great firewalls, WAFs, IDSs, IPSs, monitoring systems,
MSSPs, MDRs, everything. All of that would take care of all this for us. But as we know for a fact, just recently with Equifax, that's not the case. All the technology in the world doesn't stop something as simple as a single vulnerability.
There's nothing like tuning into your favorite security podcast to hear them talking about how to bypass the technology you just convinced management to put in place to help raise the bar on your security.
So all of this really is harder than it looks, because you have to identify everything in either your own organization or your client's organization. You have to figure out what technologies are there. We like to use the term stack, but really that software stack that you thought you bought really is just a pile of shit. You don't know where any of these components come from, and you haven't audited any of them. And you're just taking the vendor's word that everything is great. So, our core problems are when you look at web apps in general, these are really simple ones, arbitrary data being submitted when it shouldn't be done, alterations of parameters, whip open burp and start playing. Client controls are totally out of your control. All of the input that the end nodes are giving to you should be considered malicious and treated as such. And tools are everywhere. They're free. Thousands are being made every day. These are really simple problems on the outside, but they're really difficult to solve. And the big thing from, like a technical point of view, your environment, going back to that pile of shit, you don't know anything about what technologies your vendor has actually used and sold to you. Go ahead.
So, to lay the groundwork, get people focusing. We tried to identify the top 5 vulnerabilities. Injection, cross-site scripting, authentication. People understand about authenticating somebody, but not necessarily in such a way that's good, or that then they actually do authorization management behind the scenes. Because once you're into the app, if you can do everything, but if you don't restrict people in what they do, that's fine, right? Everybody's an admin. Security misconfiguration. One of the things that we've seen is people build an application. They've downloaded all these different modules from GitHub or wherever your favorite source is, and they understand the happy path through all those modules to achieve what their application does. They don't understand the added functionality they've added into the application, just sitting there waiting for us to come along and point out, because, there's only going to be people using the happy path, right? You never tried to find a new path through an app. Nobody in the room. On top of all that, you have to maintain a posture of testing for vulnerabilities. You need to be making sure your applications stay patched. And I know all of us have been in the conversation of patch versus stability. I'm sure such a conversation happened at Equifax. Everybody said it'll be fine. Nobody will exploit a vulnerability. And I don't even need to pick on them, because from my own work experience, I've been there where the guys have gone to the mat saying, we can't freaking patch that. It will cause too many problems. And nobody's looking out for, the old nobody will fill in the blank. You've all heard it.
Never heard of it.
No, what's this strut stuff?
It's an internal system. How can anybody else get to it?
Because firewalls are completely impenetrable, except they have to be, porous to work, right? So, anyway. So, did I go backwards?
No.
Okay.
You're going the right way.
So, coding mistakes, incomplete input validation. Part of that's what lets you do cross-site scripting, right? You allow fields that should never be changed. You're not checking to make sure they're running within the range. I already touched on authorization. Scaling. You start loading up a system, all of a sudden it starts falling apart because of that pile. It wasn't completely understood. Time to handle the requesting operations, things timing out that you wouldn't have expected anything to go wrong, but when it times out, things start falling apart or vulnerabilities are open. not developing to screen size. One we should have put on here. Failing to turn off debug. I mean, the first time I got an application where it dumped out a whole bunch, pages of Cold Fusion debug. And this is not yesterday, I called the help desk. And they're like, I might have been speaking Mandarin. They had no idea what it was I was talking about, let alone that shouldn't be doing that. But the reality is, even though that happened years ago, it still happens today. Not using the RESTful interfaces right. And as I hinted earlier, not all the coding mistakes in an application are the developers. They came with the code that was downloaded. The people that developed that code, I'm not going to throw them under the bus. They developed it for specific purposes and tested specific parts of it, but they haven't tested it in the context in which you're using it. So it's a little bit subtle, but that is an opportunity for things to go wrong. So what we got next? So one of the good things we found in the class, the ice cream man's here.
That song is ruined for me forever.
I got the tomato soup.
Show him the other half. Jim was prepared. No.
You want the tomato soup?
Yeah, I gotta see how I gotta match you. Sorry for the interruption.
No, you're not.
No.
Is that in your rider? So you can
We're matched. You're good.
Oh, no. I just knew the odds were amassing as I was here longer. So in any case.
Hey, love you.
And frankly, I blame Jim McMurry. So one of the cool things that happened is that we've been talking about the OWASP top 10 for a while. And I didn't know how while since it turns out it had been updated in 2013. The 2015 update never happened. Finally, in 2017, we got an updated top 10.
And it was after.
You may have to take over.
It was after we did the class in April. We were still looking, and it didn't come out until this summer.
Yeah. So the good news is the OWASP top 10 is updated, and it's almost the same as it was. They did combine 4 and 7 into broken access control. The thing is, this is a really cool, let's simplify what we should focus on, but don't only focus here. This is great for short attention span theater, but look beyond it.
That's nasty.
Yes, it is. I'll finish it. What else are we going to say on this one now that I've been completely distracted?
Next slide.
Go for it. Come on.
I can't.
Yes, you can.
Okay. Please. Uh-huh.
You have to go back.
There's been some changes. What do they mean? They say insufficient attack protection.
Who's got a functioning brain cell?
A7.
A7. You notice there's 2 new ones here. 7 and 10.
7 and 10.
Well, the whole thing, or at least can't about
Yeah.
Did it get kicked back again?
Okay, another update.
I love the reliability of... Never mind. So we were really excited about the new OWASP top 10. Let's just look at the left side of the diagram.
Okay, on to the next one.
Anyway, by the way, the release candidate that got rejected actually had in-depth on every single one of those, in case you want to go see what they turned down. So when it comes to web application testing, we're trying to explain the fundamentals, and I think you guys are used to these. We go from the black box testing where you basically tell nothing. It's like, I want to pretend I'm a hacker is what they say. This is usually, if you're doing an internal job, a really bad idea. Because while it's really cool not to know anything, you're also going to be all over the map in terms of what you're doing. You're not going to be able to focus on the core. On the other end of the scale, you've got your white box testing where you know everything, which is great in terms of being very focused on what you're doing, minimize the impact. Not per se pen testing, but it's great for source code reviews or vulnerability assessment or configuration audits. But this isn't what your attackers are doing. They don't know that much. They're not that tightly partnered. And what you're really looking for is somewhere in the middle. You're trying to get enough information so you know what's in scope, what the conditions are, but not so much that you know all the. What are you looking for? Thank you. That is a very good friend. So, we're familiar with the pen test framework, pen test methodology, and we thought we need something simpler for people to use. And could we break it down? And we were handed this gem where it really focused on recon, mapping, discovery, and exploitation. Focus there. That does leave out the reporting, and it leaves out the engagement stage. But for an internal, which is what we were focusing on, yeah, you're going to have reporting, but you're not going to have the pre-engagement set up at the same degree. And what we really were trying to teach people to do is perform the assessment. In a context of auditors and that, they're really good at generating paperwork. They already know how to do that, and they know how to do a report out. Although with a pen test, it's a bit different. But the core areas what was going to be out of their wheelhouse were these four. And this is the traditional order they're done in. Sorry, it's cut off on the bottom, but discovery's down at the bottom. And I'm sure you guys in the back can read every word up on the screen. So, you want to step in?
I mean, basically, when you're doing your recon work, what are you going to do? You're going to go and figure out all the systems that your client has. Speaking from an attacker perspective, all your systems, you're going to use DNS, you're going to find out all the subdomains, you're going to find out as much as possible passively without setting off any sort of signals on against your target. You're going to map everything out, and that mapping is actually down in the bottom. Trust me, it is. It goes social network harvesting. That's not so much anymore, really. I mean, it's not real helpful. It might give you some ideas. But mapping is the key. Mapping out all the systems that your target actually has. After mapping, you're going to do some initial recon. You're going to identify technologies. You're going to use Shodan. You're going to use just simple Google. You're going to use curl. You're going to try and identify all the technologies that your target actually has. Do some basic functional analysis and go through some sort of modeling from hey, I'm a known user, I'm an unknown user. Attempt to log in via admin pages if you can. And you're going to use all this information to map it out even further and going into discovery. Then you can get into what kind of authentication systems do they have, session management, what kind of authorization, what kind of logic that you can see, what kind of business logic. If I change this parameter, what happens on the next screen? If I try and inject anything, what happens on the next screen? And then we get into exploitation. From all of that information, we then start going into, we prioritize which one do we think is the easiest way of attacking. We're going to try and exploit it. And then what are we going to do afterwards? What are we going to do with the data that we actually find? And that actually pulls back in the recon because that actually will give us more information. That's the traditional method. And what we actually think is more of a real life situation instead of these step-by-step processes is we still sort of go through a recon, mapping, discover, and exploitation, but we sort of go back and forth between each of them because we get more information that helps us do potentially an exploit much quicker. The whole point is to do as little as possible where your client will actually notice you. And, oh wait, right there. So we go back and forth from from recon to mapping, mapping to exploitation, exploitation back to discover, back to recon. And what we try and do is try and limit to 5 attempts. That's what we try and do. 5 attempts, 5 minutes per step. Keep focused. Don't get,
Don't sit there beating your head against
Right.
the wall. I am completely guilty of just getting tunnel vision on one part of the process and need somebody to whack me upside the head to say, there's more to it that you could look at, because tunnel vision. This
Right.
is almost an ADHD model, bounce around the circle. But do it with some purpose and deliberate. Be deliberate about it. I'll never forget advice a good friend of mine gave me is, he was trying to teach me how to do cross-site scripting, and there was a known vulnerable field, and I thought I had tested all of them. And he's like, "Are you sure you tested everything?" I'm like, "Yeah." "Did you try changing what values were available from the pull-down?" "Well, no." "Then you didn't do everything, did you?" He was nicer than that. He was really nicer than that. He's a good friend. But I was like, ugh, duh moment. So I relate to this model because it reminds me to
Right.
don't always follow the rigor. This is not a drill. This is research.
So we kind of came up with what we call the cheating the win. How can we quickly get into our client site or attack someone? And the easiest question to answer first is, does the target talk to a database of any sort? And these are the kinds of tools that, not limited to these, but these are the kinds of tools that we would use against it. Is a target susceptible to cross-site scripting? These are the kinds of tools that we would use. At this point, we were actually going back to our training course that we gave, we're actually into day 2, and we were still trying to explain what a web app security methodology was, let alone explain what tools were and how to use them. Do the pages, do any of the pages reference files? So LFI or an RFI. What kind of tools are we going to use? From Zap, Burp, Nikto, Web Inspect. And then harvesting words and passwords using Cool. And, this is just a sampling, but there's a lot of other tools out there that can do these kinds of things. And
I was to say, if anybody has a favorite tool they'd like to throw out that we left off with obviously malice aforethought, throw it out. I mean, we started with free tools. We know some good non-free tools. We're not advertising any one of these. We're just saying these are things we found. There's always new cool stuff out there being developed and released all the time. Use it. Take advantage of it. This is not the be-all to end-all list.
so, knowing all of this and hearing what happened with Equifax, first of all, I feel really sorry for the security team at Equifax. I don't think it was solely their fault. Total pressure from above to follow exactly what compliance they were supposed to follow. And they were given a certain amount of money to do these checkboxes. Their vendors from Mandiant and FireEye were told these are the only things we're going to pay for. So were there issues? Yes. I'm sure a lot of their security team were burnt out and feeling underappreciated, and they probably felt like little snails. Every time they come out and try and say, "Hey, we need to do something. This doesn't look right," they're probably poked back. I don't think they actually followed any of the OWASP guidance, and they clearly had other related security issues prior to the timeline. Of course, now we find out just 2 days ago that they had another breach in March that they had not told anyone about. And I made a timeline, and actually in the past 2 years, they had 7 other breaches, either through partners of their own, Equifax's own portal, or their own systems directly. And it goes back to we're concentrating too much on checkboxes. Are we compliant with this standard? Yes. Check. And moving on. And not looking at fixing any gaps, even though we know they exist as security practitioners. And going back to, the software stack is more like a software pile. It's a piece of shit. You don't even know what the other vendor has provided to you. You haven't evaluated it properly. You haven't done your own regression test on that software that was provided. You're just hoping from a business perspective you met the minimum required standards to be operating. So, in summary, everything is critical, right? It is very complex. Web app security is. And there's a reusable approach to find and demonstrate these weaknesses. A security team really needs to have the ability to do it themselves and not to follow. Checklists are great, but you shouldn't be following just a checklist. Think outside the box, overused term, and to find those other weaknesses before an attacker actually does. Use the tools that are out there that your attacker is going to be using against your own systems. Raise your hand, stand up, and make sure that your environment is secure from these issues. And, into our second day in the training class, we were talking with the auditors that were there, and they all felt the same way, which was, they don't like to follow checkboxes, but that's all they know. And that's all they're given.
Because it's defensible.
Correct.
Because it's they have a checklist. Yep. We're good. And they're not.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, but I gotta develop a baseline and see where you are.
Correct. Correct. But of course there's going to be gaps in those checklists, and it's up to the security side to go, right?
But if you're not doing even that, then you're even worse.
Correct.
So there's a side where you can get caught up even when you're trying to do the right thing. Years ago, we were scanning ourselves with ISS. Our external auditors were scanning us with Nessus. 2 different vulnerability maps. We're getting all kinds of findings. We scan with Nessus and they're scanning with Nessus. We address the Nessus discovered vulnerabilities. No more findings. But what about the stuff ISS found that Nessus didn't find? And I'm not throwing Nessus under the bus, by the way. It's a really good product. But if you don't have good visibility into what's going on, you'll get blindsided. Because the attacker, they don't care what you scanned with or what your checklist is. They're just looking for a way they can pick their way in. They also don't care if they're going to cause, they don't want to be seen a lot, but they don't care if they potentially are going to cause waste. Mm-hmm. Burnt earth is not out of their wheelhouse. Scorched earth is not out of their wheelhouse. Yes. So where we have to kind of not cause scorched earth if we want to continue to do the jobs we do. And so I understand the balance. It's tricky. But just don't get caught up in one. Don't look around. Go ahead.
In terms like cheating to win, right? If I want my developers to cheat to win, in terms of the tools that come up on that list, what would be the best one you think to give a development team and say, put this in your process so you fight it before I do it?
So let me see if I can go back here without releasing the magic blue smoke, because that's bad. So there's a couple things. I actually think tools like Burp and Zap, where they can watch what the application is doing. They set it up as an inline proxy, and they actually watch what's going on between the front and the back, and they can see what's being passed. I mean, there's still people that think a hidden field can't be changed, all right? Now, you guys are all smiling because you know better, but it's not us we have to convince. It's our developers. It's our managers. It's those that have to understand what's important.
Specifically with Burp inline all the time, you can do a heck of a lot worse than allowing active scanning in Burp and having it all their tests through their browser, Burp finds new functionality and automatically scans. You can do a heck of a lot worse than that. And I have seen people do with kind of DevOps sec style do Nextcode scans per Git submission. So it'll make the new copy of the web app and then scan it automatically.
And you can do
continuous integration with like
right.
Jenkins. Like they'll have Burp or Zap run in Jenkins. Like you can script it so that it's working every time it gets built.
Right.
And I think even in your first example, that would run on a request. So before it's even merged in the master, you get some kind of look at it before So it says, yeah, great, pull this in for the master brand. Yeah.
So there's another piece that's starting to emerge here, and that is, we've talked about dynamic code analysis, what's running, but also there's room for static code analysis that checks the code in the code repo for known bad issues. I am so out of date on that space. I didn't put anything here on the board just because Sonar. I seem to remember there's something used to be called something like Fortify that my developers went bats over, but this is like 10 years ago, okay? So I'm not going to quote that as a current technology. Or another one I heard of, one group really loved a thing called Clockworks. Point is, static code analysis as well as dynamic code analysis should both be in the process. And I've noticed just through completely non-scientific, informal analysis, a lot of development teams have taken on static, but not as much on the dynamic side. Well, because you can feed a static code analyzer your source code in line with the update release process. Yes, sir.
Yeah, you mentioned before on the OAuth slide of the underlying OS vulnerabilities, and
Yes.
it's really easy to think about the web application standing alone, right? But it's still installed in some
Correct.
OS, so having it in your continuous integration, or remembering to do like authenticated nested scan against the host itself as well, right?
Right.
Yeah. So don't forget the host OS, or actually all of the. Well, even if it's not on here, don't forget the OS. Don't forget the hardware it's living on. Oh, and don't forget your how about your network gear? I mean, community strings that are well known.
How can you bypass your WAF?
SSHN is root.
Yeah.
How about
Forget it.
because that old Cisco router that management won't replace that still only supports Telnet is perfectly fine, right? Nobody will pop that, will they?
Right.
And community stream of public is perfectly fine, right? Yeah, absolutely. That's even better. So I guess the point here is be holistic. Look at the entire environment. And oh, by the way, if you're not monitoring the hell out of the environment, why aren't you? There's some good talks here. I see a hand way at the back.
Our environment, we, I guess, as security people tend to forget about maybe two of the most important politics and management.
We actually have that right down here. There are people who don't want us to patch because it affects business operations.
Exactly. I mean, and you as a security person have to take that into account. I mean,
Correct.
You can do all you can and say, hey, we got to patch this, but if your manager or someone else's manager ends up dropping the hammer and says, no, we can't, then you have to be satisfied and say, okay, well, I've warned you, whatever else happens.
And that goes back to, I actually feel sorry for the Equifax security team. The vulnerability comes out March 2nd. It's patched within, 5 to 7 days. And I'm sure production side went, well, you can't change anything. It's going to take a change management, which is 90 days. You have to do regression testing. You have to do this. You have to do that. And there's your giant window.
So to emphasize something I said the other day is that we were talking about the latest WordPress vulnerability, but we know that WordPress, Joomla, Drupal are known for having vulnerabilities, and they're high risk because pretty much they have permission to modify the entire web application environment because that they're taking that and putting it in a user going through a web browser instead of having somebody administering.
Equifax chose Equifax Security 2017 that hosted on WordPress.
So my point was it would be better for these sites to have good, aggressive backups that you know how to restore and then full autopilot on applying the updates rather than taking the risk of compromise while you spend 6 months doing regression testing to make sure absolutely every feature on every page always worked. Just the stakes are too high because the bad guys are attacking us continuously. And if you don't think they are, you're missing it. Because, nobody's too obscure because if you're not a great target for as an endpoint, you're a great target as a node. So, can I throw more cliches in there, or is that enough? All righty, Buzzword Bingo, we have a winner. Any other questions? So let me try not to
And
get.
number 11 is secure information that's been cached.
I think we did this slide.
I think so.
This one?
Oh, and if you want the
Yeah.
the slides, we'll email them to you.
Yes, we'll be happy to. Anybody send us an email. We'll happily send you the deck. We'd love to share. And if you've got something you think, oh my God, how could you have missed X? Send it.
Do you have your contact information on the first line and just
Yeah.
Yes.
Go back to the first slide.
Okay. Don't get dizzy. I just don't want to take a chance working on the bottom bar here. So.
there it is.
There. Logos. Yes, we do. We both do.
Yeah, you do.
Yeah. If you look for Jim McMurray or Lee Neely, you'll find us on Twitter.